Evicted and shivering, the pregnant food vendor dropped her last shiny coin into the cup of a blind street beggar, completely unaware she had just passed the ultimate test of the continent's most ruthless oil tycoon. Long before this fateful encounter in the dust of the streets, Amaka had known nothing but the heavy burden of survival. She was an orphan, stripped of her parents by a devastating fever when she was only a child, a tragedy that thrust her into a life of relentless suffering. Now, at 23 years old and 7 months pregnant, her daily existence was a grueling testament to endurance. Every morning, long before the sun dared to rise over the sprawling city of Lagos, Amaka was already awake. The dilapidated cement house she shared with her husband and his mother offered no comfort. She would step out into the humid, thick air, her bare feet sinking slightly into the cold red earth. For hours, she would hunch over a rusted metal grill, tending to a charcoal fire that seemed to consume her youth as greedily as it consumed the dry wood. The thick, suffocating smoke stung her eyes and coated her throat, while the intense heat from the glowing embers blistered her calloused hands. She roasted plantains and yams for the early commuters, the sweet, heavy scent of caramelizing fruit mixing with the sharp odor of exhaust fumes from the nearby road. Her ankles, swollen from the weight of the child growing inside her, throbbed with a dull, persistent agony. Yet, she never complained. She stood by the fire, her torn cotton dress clinging to her, sweating back, believing that her hard work would eventually bring peace to her household. Little did she know, her sacrifice was entirely in vain. Amaka had married Obinna with a heart full of hope. She had spent years working tirelessly, saving every crumpled naira she earned to support him while he claimed to be looking for employment. But success reveals character. It does not change it. As the months passed and the season changed, Obinna grew distant and cruel. He stopped looking for work. He began returning home late into the night, his shirts carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of expensive imported perfume. Something fundamental had shifted in his gaze when he looked at her. Where there was once mild affection, there was now only deep, unconcealed irritation. He looked at her swollen belly and soot-stained hands not with gratitude, but with disgust. Unknown to Amaka, Obinna had found a new ambition. He had secretly begun an affair with Folake, the arrogant daughter of a wealthy real estate family. Folake wore silk suits, drove a luxury vehicle, and possessed a bank account that made Obinna blind to all morality. Obinna's mother, a woman whose greed was as boundless as the ocean, actively encouraged the betrayal. She despised Amaka for her poverty. She wanted a daughter-in-law who could elevate their status, not an orphan who smelled of roasted plantains and charcoal smoke. Together, the mother and son silently plotted to remove the burden that was Amaka. The storm was coming, and it arrived on a night when the sky seemed to crack open with fury. The heavy clouds had gathered over the city, turning the late afternoon into pitch-black darkness. Distant thunder rolled like warning drums, and soon a torrential downpour began to batter the rusted corrugated iron roof of their small house. Amaka had just returned from the market, her clothes soaked, her body trembling from exhaustion. She stepped into the dim light of the living room, only to find Obinna and his mother standing near the doorway. Their faces were set like stone. The older woman's voice carried the sharpness of broken glass as she suddenly began to scream, her words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. She pointed a trembling finger at Amaka, accusing the pregnant woman of stealing money from her secret wooden lockbox. She declared violently that a thief could not live under her roof. Amaka froze, her heart beating faster against her ribs. The words hit her like a slap across the face. She dropped the small basket of vegetables she was holding, shaking her head desperately. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she pleaded her innocence, her hands trembling as she reached out to her husband for defense. She begged Obinna to speak the truth, reminding him of all the years she had starved so he could eat. But Obinna simply turned his face away. He crossed his arms and coldly stated that he could no longer trust her, his voice devoid of any human warmth. He told her she was nothing but a burden, a useless beggar who had brought nothing but shame to his name. The sheer cruelty of his silence hurt far more than the mother's fabricated lies. What nobody could see was the quiet strength that held Amaka together, even as her world shattered into pieces. Before Amaka could gather her belongings or process the betrayal, the mother-in-law lunged forward. With a surprising, ruthless strength, she grabbed Amaka by the arm and shoved her toward the open door. Amaka stumbled, her hands instinctively flying to protect her swollen belly as she fell forward into the unforgiving storm. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, the metallic click of the deadbolt echoing with finality. The cold rain hit her instantly, soaking through her thin, torn dress in seconds. She knelt in the thick, slippery red mud, the freezing water running down her face and mixing with her bitter tears. The wind howled around her, a cruel symphony of rejection. She dragged herself toward the small, narrow overhang of the roof, seeking a tiny sliver of shelter from the blinding rain. Her body shook uncontrollably. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs, a painful reminder of the innocent life she now had to protect alone. As the hours dragged on and the midnight chill deepened, Amaka pulled her knees to her chest, trying to preserve whatever warmth remained in her shivering frame. In the terrifying darkness of the street, she retreated into her own mind. She remembered the gentle face of her late mother. She recalled the promise she had made as a little girl standing by a fresh grave, swearing to always keep her heart pure, no matter how wicked the world became. She wondered why destiny had handed her such a heavy cross to bear. She had given everything, yet she was treated like discarded refuse. She reached into the deep pocket of her wet dress, her numb fingers brushing against a single, hard object. It was a shiny coin, her entire life savings, her complete net worth. It was not enough to buy a meal, let alone a shelter. A profound, consuming loneliness washed over her. She was invisible, a ghost taking up space in a world that did not want her. Yet, as she clutched the cold coin in her trembling hand, she whispered a quiet prayer into the storm, asking for the strength to survive the night. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning. Days slowly turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But Amaka's circumstances did not change. The memory of that freezing, stormy night when she was thrown out by her husband felt like a distant nightmare. Yet the reality of her new life was infinitely harsher. With no family to turn to and nowhere to hide from the harsh elements, she was forced to make the unforgiving streets of Lagos her new home. She found a small, neglected corner near a busy intersection, a dusty patch of earth squeezed between an open drainage ditch and a crumbling concrete wall. Here, she built her life from scratch. She gathered discarded bricks from a nearby construction site to form a makeshift stove, collecting broken twigs, dry leaves, and scavenged charcoal dust to keep a small fire burning. By the 8th month of her pregnancy, the physical toll on Amaka's body was catastrophic. Waking up every morning was a battle against her own failing strength. She slept on flattened cardboard boxes, her bones aching from the hard ground, her spine screaming in protest every time she tried to sit up. The scorching sun beat down on her mercilessly throughout the day, baking the asphalt and sending waves of suffocating heat radiating into her face. The dust from thousands of passing cars coated her skin and hair, settling into her lungs with every breath she took. Her feet were now so swollen they could no longer fit into her worn-out sandals, forcing her to stand barefoot on the burning ground as she roasted small batches of cheap yams and overripe plantains. Hunger was her constant companion. It gnawed at her empty stomach, a hollow, persistent ache that she tried to ignore for the sake of her unborn child. Most days, she barely sold enough to buy a cup of clean drinking water and a handful of peanuts for herself. When she looked at the bustling crowds walking past her, she felt a profound sense of isolation. Hundreds of people walked by her small roasting stand every hour, but nobody truly saw her. She had learned to take up as little space as possible, keeping her head bowed, speaking only when spoken to, a discarded shadow on the edge of the vibrant city. Yet, In the quiet moments between the chaos of the traffic, Amaka would rest her calloused hands on her growing belly and fall into deep reflection. She thought about Obinna and the comfortable life he was now living with Folake. She wondered how a man could sleep peacefully in a soft bed knowing his own flesh and blood was sleeping next to an open gutter. But anger did not consume her. Instead, a quiet strength began to crystallize in her heart. She realized that wealth and comfort had poisoned her husband's soul, replacing his humanity with a hollow greed. She promised her unborn baby that they would never become like that, even if they had to eat dirt to survive. She would teach her child the value of integrity and compassion. True wealth is measured not in gold, but in the kindness we show to strangers. One particular afternoon, something unusual happened. The sun was at its absolute peak, beating down with a terrifying intensity. Amaka was feeling exceptionally weak, her vision blurring at the edges from severe dehydration. As she wiped the sweat from her eyes, she noticed a commotion a few yards away. A figure was slowly shuffling down the crowded pavement, drawing groans of disgust from everyone who crossed his path. It was a blind beggar. His appearance was deeply unsettling. He was dressed in rags that were stiff with layers of dried mud and filth. A dark, stained cloth was wrapped tightly over his eyes, and he leaned heavily on a crooked wooden stick, his steps uncertain and trembling. But it was the smell that made people turn away. A foul, overpowering odor of rotting garbage and stale sweat radiated from him, hanging in the hot, humid air like a toxic cloud. As he blindly navigated the pavement, he held out a cracked plastic cup, his voice a barely audible, raspy whisper begging for loose change. The cruelty of the city was swift and unforgiving. A well-dressed businessman in a sharp silk suit brushed past the old man, violently shoving him aside and muttering a curse about the streets being filled with trash. The beggar stumbled, losing his balance entirely. He crashed onto the hard concrete, his wooden stick clattering away, his plastic cup rolling into the dusty gutter. A group of teenagers standing nearby burst into cruel laughter, mocking his clumsy fall. A female vendor selling cold drinks hissed loudly, telling the blind man to crawl back into the hole he came from because his stench was ruining her business. Not a single person offered a hand to help him up. They simply stepped over him, treating him as an obstacle rather than a human being. Tears rolled down Amaka's cheeks as she watched the horrific scene unfold. A heavy lump formed in her throat. In that frail, humiliated man, scraping his hands against the pavement, she saw a reflection of her own profound misery. She remembered the night she was thrown into the mud, the night she begged for mercy and received only silence. She knew the agonizing sting of being treated like an animal. Her heart began beating faster, an overwhelming wave of empathy drowning out her own exhaustion. Amaka had not eaten a single thing since the previous afternoon. Resting on her small grill was one last piece of roasted yam, which she had been saving to quiet the painful rumbling in her stomach before trying to sleep. But as she watched the blind man blindly feeling the ground for his walking stick, her decision was made. She slowly pushed herself up from her wooden stool, her joints popping, her heavy belly throwing her off balance. Ignoring the sharp pains shooting up her spine, she hobbled toward the fallen man. She knelt down beside him, the heat of the pavement burning through her thin dress. The overpowering stench of his unwashed clothes hit her instantly, making her eyes water, but she did not flinch or pull away. Gently, she reached out and placed her calloused hand over his trembling arm. The blind man flinched violently at her touch, expecting another blow, another harsh word. Instead, Amaka spoke to him in a voice as soft and comforting as a gentle breeze. She told him not to be afraid, assuring him that she was there to help. With incredible effort, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and slowly helped him sit up against the low concrete wall. She retrieved his wooden stick and placed it securely in his hand. Then, she walked back to her grill, picked up her only piece of roasted yam, and brought it to him. She pressed the warm food into his dirty hands, ignoring her own stomach, which was practically screaming for nourishment. She told him it was not much, but it would keep the hunger away for a few hours. The blind beggar did not speak. His hands trembled as he felt the warmth of the food. He brought it to his mouth and took a slow, deliberate bite. But Amaka was not finished. She reached deep into the pocket of her faded dress. Her fingers brushed against a single, shiny coin. It was not just money. It was the only physical memory left of her late mother. A lucky coin she had sworn never to spend, even if she were starving to death. She had survived by scavenging scraps from the market just to buy her rusted grill, guarding this coin with her life. But she looked at the man's torn clothes, his sightless eyes hidden behind the dirty cloth, and she felt a surge of pure, unselfish love. She placed her mother's coin into his cup, the only money she had in the entire world. A brief, terrifying thought flashed through her mind. If she gave this away, she would have absolutely nothing. She would be completely destitute. But she looked at the man's torn clothes, his sightless eyes hidden behind the dirty cloth, and she felt a surge of pure, unselfish love. She picked up his cracked plastic cup from the dirt, wiped the dust off its rim, and placed it in his lap. Then, with a steady hand, she dropped her last shiny coin into the cup. The small piece of metal made a sharp, clear sound as it hit the plastic. The words left her lips so softly, yet they carried the weight of a saint's blessing. She whispered a prayer for him, asking the heavens to guide his steps and protect him from the cruelty of the world. The blind man stopped chewing. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to memorize the exact tone and vibration of her voice. For a long moment, the chaos of the Lagos traffic seemed to fade away, leaving only the profound silence between two abandoned souls. His dirty, trembling fingers reached out, blindly searching the air, until they briefly brushed against her knuckles. For the first time in her life, Amaka felt that someone had seen her, truly seen her, even without eyes. She slowly stood up, her back throbbing, and returned to her empty grill. She was exhausted, starving, and entirely penniless, yet a strange, peaceful warmth settled over her heart. She had done what was right. She had kept her promise to her mother. Little did she know, this small act of kindness would change her life forever. She had no idea that the pathetic, foul-smelling beggar sitting against the wall was not a beggar at all. She had just passed the ultimate test, designed by a man who could buy the entire city with a single signature. The storm was already among them, and the real trials were about to begin. As the weeks went by, a strange and silent routine established itself on that dusty corner of the Lagos intersection. The blind beggar never left. He claimed a permanent spot just a few feet away from Amaka's roasting grill, sitting cross-legged in the dirt from dawn until dusk. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only in hushed, unintelligible whispers. Yet, Amaka found an odd sense of comfort in his presence. Whenever she managed to sell a few extra pieces of yam, she would buy a small loaf of cheap bread and divide it equally between them. She would speak to him while she fanned her charcoal fire, telling him stories about the child growing inside her, sharing her fears about the upcoming delivery, and recalling the distant memories of her parents. The blind man would simply sit there, his head tilted toward her voice, absorbing every word, every sigh, and every suppressed sob. He was listening, analyzing, and remembering. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of a trial that would shake the very foundations of their world. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Obinna and Folake were living entirely consumed by their own vanity. They spent their days touring luxury real estate, dining in five-star restaurants, and planning a wedding that was meant to be the social event of the year. Wealth had amplified their worst traits. Obinna had completely forgotten the woman who had starved to feed him, replacing his guilt with a toxic arrogance. He wore custom-tailored silk suits and drove a gleaming white luxury vehicle gifted to him by Folake's father. He felt invincible, completely detached from the poverty he had once known. One particular afternoon, the suffocating heat of the dry season hung heavily over the city. Amaka was struggling to keep her eyes open. Her pregnancy was now in its 8th month, and the physical burden was agonizing. Her lower back throbbed with a relentless, sharp pain, and her swollen feet felt as though they were walking on broken glass. She was busy turning a row of plantains over the glowing coals when a massive, pristine white luxury vehicle pulled up to the curb, its tires kicking a cloud of red dust onto her small wooden stand. The heavy doors opened, and out stepped Obinna and Folake. They had stopped to inspect a commercial property across the street, but fate had other plans. Folake, wearing a stunning red silk dress and gold-rimmed sunglasses, spotted the dilapidated roasting stand first. She paused, her perfectly manicured hand gripping Obinna's arm. As she recognized the pregnant woman sweating behind the smoke, a wicked, triumphant smile spread across her face. She practically dragged Obinna toward the stand, eager to display her dominance. Amaka's heart began beating faster as the couple approached. A lump formed in her throat, choking off the air to her lungs. She instinctively took a step back, her hands moving to shield her heavy belly. She looked at Obinna, searching his eyes for even a flicker of regret or recognition, but his gaze was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of humanity. He looked at her as if she were a piece of trash that had blown onto his expensive leather shoes. Something about the way Folake looked at Amaka's worn-out dress pierced her deeply. Folake removed her sunglasses, her eyes narrowing with vicious delight as she spat the words that had been sitting on her tongue. She loudly declared that the street smelled like rotting garbage, pointing a manicured finger at Amaka and calling her a fat, useless pig who was polluting the city. She laughed a cruel, high-pitched laugh, asking Obinna how he had ever tolerated living with such a disgusting creature. The words hit Amaka like a slap across the face. She lowered her head, the humiliation burning her cheeks hotter than the charcoal fire. She whispered softly, begging them to leave her alone and go in peace. But Folake was not satisfied with verbal cruelty. With a sudden vicious swing of her expensive designer heel, Folake kicked the edge of Amaka's metal grill. The tray tipped over violently. Dozens of perfectly roasted plantains and yams, the product of hours of agonizing labor in the blistering sun, tumbled into the filthy, oil-stained dirt of the gutter. Amaka gasped, dropping to her knees in the dirt. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she desperately tried to salvage the ruined food, her hands burning against the hot coals that had scattered across the pavement. This was her entire livelihood for the week, destroyed in a single second of malicious joy. She looked up at Obinna from the dirt, a silent plea for mercy written in her weeping eyes. But Obinna simply laughed. He adjusted his expensive watch, looked down at the pregnant woman crying in the mud, and stated coldly that she belonged in the dirt with the rest of the animals. He told her she was nothing but a burden, and that no one would ever want someone like her. The words left his lips so smoothly, yet they echoed loudly in the crowded street. There was no taking it back now. Folake linked her arm through his, and the wealthy couple walked back to their air-conditioned vehicle, leaving Amaka shattered in the dust. Throughout the entire ordeal, the blind beggar sat motionless against the wall. His head was turned toward the couple, his hidden eyes tracking their every movement, his ears capturing the exact pitch of their cruel laughter. He did not intervene, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched in his dirt-streaked cheek. Later that evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Amaka sat alone in the dark. The city traffic slowed to a low rumble. She had managed to wash a few pieces of the fallen food, sharing the meager, gritty meal with the blind man. But inside, her soul was bleeding. She leaned her tired head against the cold concrete wall and descended into a deep, agonizing internal monologue. She questioned the very nature of the universe. Why had she been chosen for this specific brand of torture? She closed her eyes and saw memories flashing like a broken film reel. She remembered the night she had gone to sleep drinking only tap water so Obinna could have a full plate of rice. She remembered defending him when the neighbors called him lazy. She had poured her entire youth, her health, and her heart into a vessel that was completely broken. A terrifying fear gripped her chest as she placed her blistered hands over her kicking baby. What kind of world was she bringing this innocent child into? A world where cruelty was rewarded with luxury vehicles and where absolute sacrifice was paid with starvation and public mockery. She wondered if her late mother had been wrong. Perhaps keeping a pure heart was not a virtue but a fatal weakness. Perhaps the only way to survive in this city was to become as ruthless and wicked as Folake and Obinna. But as she listened to the rhythmic, raspy breathing of the blind beggar sleeping nearby, she knew she could not change who she was. She could not harden her heart. She would rather die in poverty than live in a palace built on another person's tears. What nobody could see was the quiet strength that held her together, a resilience forged in the hottest fires of suffering. Days slowly turned into weeks, and the burden of survival grew heavier. Amaka was now approaching her 9th month. Her movements were agonizingly slow, her breathing labored and shallow. The small amount of money she had saved from selling roasted plantains was nowhere near enough to pay for a hospital delivery. Panic began to set in, as the reality of giving birth on the street loomed over her. One sweltering morning, the universe decided to test her endurance once again. Amaka had walked 3 blocks to a public pump, carrying a heavy plastic bucket to fetch clean water. Her back screamed in agony with every step she took on the return journey. When she finally reached her small corner, she found the blind beggar coughing violently, his throat parched from the thick city dust. Without hesitation, Amaka poured a large cup of her precious, hard-earned water and knelt beside him to help him drink. Unknown to Amaka, at that very moment, her former mother-in-law was walking down the same street. The older woman was returning from a high-end fabric market, her arms laden with expensive lace materials purchased with Folake's money. She wore a bright, ostentatious dress and heavy gold jewelry that jingled as she walked. As she passed the intersection, her eyes landed on Amaka. A wave of pure, irrational fury washed over the older woman. She saw the pregnant girl she had thrown out, still alive, still refusing to disappear, and now associating with a filthy, foul-smelling vagrant. The mother-in-law marched over, her face twisted into a mask of ugly rage. Without a single word of warning, she raised her heavy hand and delivered a vicious, ringing slap across Amaka's face. The force of the blow sent Amaka tumbling backward into the dust, the plastic cup flying from her hands and splashing water across the dry earth. The blind beggar recoiled, raising his trembling hands to protect his face. The mother-in-law stood over them, her chest heaving with indignation. She pointed at the beggar, her voice carrying the shrill tone of absolute hatred. She screamed that Amaka was a disgrace to womanhood, a cursed orphan who was now rolling in the gutters with madmen and diseased animals. She loudly proclaimed to the gathering crowd that this was the reason she had kicked the worthless girl out of her house, to protect her respectable son from such filth. The words dropped like a stone into the heavy air, drawing the stares and whispers of dozens of bystanders. Amaka's cheek burned with a fierce, radiating pain. The taste of copper filled her mouth. But as the mother-in-law raised her foot to kick the blind beggar in his ribs, a sudden, fierce, protective instinct ignited inside Amaka. Ignoring her massive belly and her aching bones, she scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She threw her body over the frail, dirty figure of the blind man, taking the heavy blow of the older woman's shoe directly against her own shoulder. She cried out in pain, but she did not move. She looked up at the woman who was supposed to be a grandmother to her unborn child, her voice shaking but defiant. She begged the woman to hit her if she must, but to leave the poor old man alone because he had done nothing wrong. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads in pity, but no one stepped forward to stop the abuse. The mother-in-law spat on the ground near Amaka's face. She adjusted her expensive lace wrappers, looked down with pure contempt, and declared that a dog will always return to its vomit. With a final, disdainful scoff, she turned and marched away, leaving Amaka trembling in the dirt, still firmly shielding the stranger. As the crowd dispersed, Amaka slowly sat up. Her shoulder throbbed where the shoe had struck her. She reached out and gently brushed the dust from the blind man's ragged shirt, asking softly if he was hurt. The blind man did not answer. Behind his dark, stained cloth, tears were silently pooling. He had built empires, commanded thousands of men, and destroyed corporations with a single phone call. He was used to people bowing to him, fearing him, and lying to him to gain a fraction of his wealth. But never in his entire life, across all the continents he had traveled, had anyone used their own body to shield him from pain. He felt the trembling hands of the destitute, pregnant girl wiping the dirt from his arms, and a profound, terrifying anger began to build deep within his chest. It was an anger that would soon burn the world of the wicked to the ground. Little did Amaka know, every tear she shed that day was being counted, and the reckoning was drawing closer with every passing second. As the weeks went by, the relentless march of time brought Amaka to the very edge of her physical and emotional limits. She was now deep into her 9th month of pregnancy. Every breath she took required a monumental effort, and the dull ache in her lower back had sharpened into a constant, blinding agony. The terrifying reality of giving birth on the dirty pavement haunted her every waking moment. She knew she needed money, even just a few thousand naira, to pay for the cheapest local clinic so her child would not be delivered in the dust of the open streets. Desperation drove her to seek work far beyond her small roasting stand. Word had spread through the local street vendors about a massive, extravagant engagement party being held at one of the most exclusive gated estates in the city. The wealthy families were hiring temporary day laborers just to manage the sheer volume of trash and catering waste. Amaka did not know who was hosting the party, nor did she care. She slowly gathered her meager strength, leaving the blind beggar with a small piece of bread and a promise to return before dark. She walked for 2 hours under the unforgiving sun, her swollen feet bleeding inside her worn-out sandals, until she reached the towering iron gates of the luxury compound. The contrast between her world and the estate was staggering. Luxury vehicles of every make and model lined the manicured driveways, gleaming under the golden afternoon sun. Inside the massive outdoor pavilion, crystal chandeliers were suspended from towering white tents, casting a soft, expensive glow over tables draped in imported silk. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive spices, and French champagne, a sickeningly rich aroma that made Amaka's empty stomach twist in knots. Wealthy guests milled about in tailored silk suits and heavy lace gowns, the women sparkling with gold-rimmed jewelry that caught the light with every movement. Amaka begged the catering manager for any job available. Seeing her massive belly and desperate eyes, he reluctantly handed her a pair of thick rubber gloves and ordered her to stay completely out of sight. Her job was to haul the heavy black garbage bags from the kitchen to the disposal bins at the far end of the property. For hours, Amaka dragged herself back and forth through the hidden service corridors. The physical exertion was catastrophic. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and soaking her torn cotton dress. The foul smell of rotting food and discarded alcohol from the garbage bags clung to her skin, overwhelming her senses. Yet, every time she felt her knees buckling, she thought of her unborn child. She endured the agonizing pain, whispering silent prayers for strength, focused entirely on the small wage she would receive at the end of the night. But fate had other, much crueler plans. By early evening, the party was at its absolute peak. The music swelled, and the laughter of the corporate elite echoed through the gardens. Exhausted and dizzy from severe dehydration, Amaka accidentally took a wrong turn down a heavily lit garden path, dragging a leaking garbage bag behind her. She froze in terror as she realized she had stumbled directly into the main reception area. She turned to run, but her heavy, swollen feet betrayed her. From across the manicured lawn, a sharp, piercing voice sliced through the elegant music. It was the mother-in-law. She was dressed in an extravagant gold outfit, holding a crystal glass of wine, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief as she spotted the pregnant, garbage-covered girl. A malicious, predatory gleam instantly ignited in her eyes. This was the ultimate opportunity to cement her loyalty to her new wealthy daughter-in-law. Without a moment of hesitation, the mother-in-law marched across the grass, her heavy footsteps echoing her malicious intent. She grabbed Amaka roughly by the arm, her painted fingernails digging viciously into the pregnant woman's bruised flesh. Amaka cried out in pain, dropping the garbage bag, pleading quietly to be let go, explaining that she was only there to work. But the older woman did not listen. With a terrifying surge of violent energy, she dragged Amaka, stumbling and weeping, right into the dead center of the brightly lit pavilion. The music slowly faded away. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses ceased. Hundreds of eyes belonging to the most powerful people in the city turned to stare at the bizarre, horrific spectacle. Amaka stood trembling under the blinding spotlights, her torn, sweat-soaked dress clinging to her massive belly, her bare, bleeding feet exposed on the pristine white carpet. She tried to shield her face with her dirty hands, a profound, soul-crushing humiliation washing over her. Sitting on a raised, velvet-covered platform at the front of the pavilion were the guests of honor, Obinna and Folake. Amaka's heart began beating faster, pounding so violently she thought her chest might crack open. She looked up and locked eyes with her husband. Obinna sat frozen for a fraction of a second, but instead of showing even a sliver of mercy, he quickly composed his face into a mask of total disgust, eager to prove to his wealthy guests that he had no connection to this filthy creature. Folake slowly stood up, her red silk dress flowing around her like a pool of blood. She stepped down from the platform, holding a glass of dark red wine, a wicked, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She approached Amaka like a predator circling a wounded animal. Folake spoke in a loud, theatrical voice, ensuring every single guest in the pavilion could hear her. She asked the crowd how a stray, fat, diseased pig had managed to wander into a gathering of decent people, her voice dripping with absolute venom. The crowd erupted into a chorus of cruel laughter. Wealthy businessmen pointed and sneered, while elegant women covered their noses with lace handkerchiefs in mock disgust. The words hit Amaka like a slap across the face. Tears rolled down her cheeks, cutting clean lines through the charcoal dust and sweat on her face. She looked at Obinna, begging him with a broken, breathless whisper to let her leave, reminding him that she was carrying his child. Something about the way she pleaded seemed to irritate Folake even more. She stepped directly in front of Amaka, her eyes flashing with pure malice. With a sudden, deliberate flick of her wrist, Folake poured the entire glass of dark red wine directly onto the pristine white carpet, right over the toe of her own diamond-encrusted high heel. The dark liquid splashed violently, staining Folake's shoe and splashing onto Amaka's bare ankles. Folake looked down at Amaka, her voice dropping to a cold, commanding hiss. She ordered Amaka to get down on her hands and knees and clean the shoe with her dirty, torn dress. She declared that if Amaka wanted to act like a beggar, she needed to learn how to serve her betters. The sheer cruelty of the demand sent a shockwave of silence through the crowd, but nobody intervened. They simply watched, waiting to see if the pregnant woman would actually submit. Amaka's entire body trembled. A heavy lump formed in her throat, choking off her breath. She looked at the mother-in-law, who was nodding vigorously, shouting at her to obey her new master. She looked at Obinna, who simply took a sip from his glass and looked away, completely discarding her humanity. A terrifying internal monologue consumed Amaka's mind. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back. But she remembered the few thousand naira the catering manager had promised her, the money that would keep her baby from being born in the gutter. Her pride meant nothing compared to the life inside her. Slowly, agonizingly, Amaka bent her knees. Her spine screamed in protest, and a sharp, terrifying cramp ripped through her abdomen. She lowered her heavy, swollen body onto the wet, wine-stained carpet. She bowed her head, gathered the hem of her filthy, torn dress, and reached out with shaking hands to wipe the expensive shoe of the woman who had stolen her life. The crowd gasped in morbid satisfaction. The humiliation was absolute, profound, and devastating. But as Amaka scrubbed the shoe, weeping silently onto the carpet, a new sound cut through the murmurs of the wealthy guests. It was a disturbance coming from the towering iron gates of the estate. The blind beggar had not stayed, at the corner. Driven by an unexplainable instinct, he had slowly tracked Amaka's path, navigating the dangerous city streets for hours, using nothing but his crooked wooden stick and the faint memory of her scent. When he reached the massive gates of the estate, the private security guards, armed with heavy batons, immediately blocked his path. They shouted at him, telling the foul-smelling vagrant to back away. But the blind man did not stop. He kept pushing forward, demanding in his raspy, broken voice to see the pregnant woman who had entered the compound. The guards, eager to impress their wealthy employers, did not hesitate. They shoved the frail old man violently backward. He hit the paved driveway hard, his wooden stick clattering out of reach. One of the guards raised his heavy baton and struck the beggar across the ribs, a sickening thud echoing in the night air. They kicked him, cursing his existence, treating him worse than a stray dog. From her humiliating position on the floor of the pavilion, Amaka heard the commotion. She recognized that raspy, broken voice instantly. A surge of desperate adrenaline flooded her veins. Forgetting the pain in her belly, she tried to scramble up from the floor, screaming for them to stop hurting him. But before she could stand, the mother-in-law stepped forward and shoved her hard by the shoulder. Amaka collapsed back onto the wet carpet, her heavy belly striking the ground with a terrifying impact. The pain was immediate and blinding. Amaka curled into a tight ball, clutching her stomach, her screams tearing through the elegant pavilion. The words dropped like a stone into her soul as she realized she was losing everything. She lay on the cold ground, surrounded by luxury vehicles, silk suits, and mountains of expensive food, bleeding from her heart and her body. She looked up at the crystal chandeliers blurring through her tears, and a profound, total despair washed over her. Where were the gods her mother had spoken of? Why was absolute cruelty rewarded with wealth, while her pure, unselfish sacrifice was paid with physical torture and public disgrace? She closed her eyes, preparing to surrender to the darkness, believing that the storm had finally broken her spirit completely. Neither of them knew that this was the exact moment the universe had been waiting for. The testing phase was over. The gathered storm was about to unleash a devastating fury upon the wicked, and the world of the arrogant was about to be burned to ashes. The private security guards dragged the frail body of the blind beggar toward the deep concrete drainage ditch just outside the estate walls. They laughed, their heavy boots kicking up dust, preparing to toss the old man into the filthy water like a bag of rotting garbage. Inside the pavilion, the music resumed its elegant tempo, trying to drown out the horrifying sounds of Amaka weeping in agony on the wet carpet. The wealthy guests turned their faces back to their champagne, completely indifferent to the destruction of 2 human lives. But the universe had seen enough. The time for tests was over. As the guards dragged him toward the ditch, the blind beggar's hand slipped into the deep pocket of his torn trousers. His thumb found a small, hidden device disguised as a broken button, a silent, encrypted SOS transmitter connected directly to a tactical security team that had been shadowing him from exactly half a mile away for the past 6 months. He pressed it. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble. It was not a subtle vibration, but a deep, rhythmic shaking that vibrated through the soles of every expensive leather shoe in the pavilion. The elegant music was instantly drowned out by the terrifying, deafening roar of heavy engines. Blinding white halogen lights pierced through the darkness of the street. Not 1, but 10 massive, military-grade, bulletproof sport utility vehicles painted in midnight black smashed violently through the towering iron gates of the luxury compound. The heavy metal gates, built to keep the poor out, twisted and groaned before tearing completely off their reinforced hinges. The fleet of black vehicles swarmed the manicured driveway, their tires tearing up the pristine lawns, completely surrounding the brightly lit pavilion in a tactical, inescapable circle. The security guards outside froze in absolute terror, dropping the blind beggar onto the pavement. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. Dozens of massive men stepped out. They wore sharp, black suits. They moved with terrifying, lethal precision. Within 3 seconds, the estate security guards were pinned face down against the concrete, their weapons stripped, their arms twisted painfully behind their backs. Inside the pavilion, absolute panic erupted. The wealthy businessmen backed away, shouting in confusion. The elegant women shrieked, clutching their gold jewelry. Obinna jumped up from his velvet chair, looking around frantically. Folake stood frozen, her glass of wine trembling in her manicured hand. The mother-in-law retreated, hiding behind a table of catered food. Then, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the entire estate. Outside, the blind beggar stopped coughing. He placed his dirty hands flat against the asphalt. He pushed himself up. He did not stumble. He did not reach for his crooked wooden stick. He stood up. He stood perfectly straight. He was not limping anymore. He reached up to his face. He untied the filthy dark cloth from his eyes. He dropped it into the dirt. He stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the blinding halogen lights of the pavilion. His clothes were still torn and coated in foul-smelling mud, but his physical posture had completely transformed. His shoulders were broad. His chest was lifted. His gaze was no longer the wandering, sightless stare of a victim. It was the sharp, piercing, merciless glare of a predator. He walked with the slow, terrifying authority of a king walking into a conquered village. From the center of the crowd, an older man with silver hair stepped forward. It was Folake's father, the billionaire real estate developer hosting the party. His face drained of all color, his eyes bulged in sheer, unadulterated horror. He dropped his expensive imported cigar onto the carpet. His knees buckled slightly as he whispered a single name, his voice trembling with absolute dread. Adeyemi? The name echoed through the silent pavilion like a gunshot. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Every corporate executive, every wealthy socialite, and every ambitious politician in the room instantly recognized that name. This was not a vagrant. This was Adeyemi, the most ruthless, elusive, and powerful oil tycoon on the African continent, a man whose personal net worth eclipsed the gross domestic product of small nations, a man who sat on the board of every major bank, who controlled the shipping ports, and who, crucially, owned the primary holding company that financed Folake's entire family real estate empire. Folake's glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Adeyemi did not look at the billionaires bowing their heads in fear. He walked straight past them, the crowd parting like the Red Sea, terrified to even breathe his scent. He walked directly to the center of the room, where Amaka was curled in a tight ball on the floor, weeping in pain. Adeyemi knelt down. The ruthless oil baron, wearing clothes stiff with gutter mud, dropped to one knee on the wine-stained carpet. His eyes, which had watched corporations burn without a flinch, softened with an overwhelming, profound tenderness. He reached out with his strong hands and gently lifted Amaka's tear-stained face. He looked into her terrified eyes and spoke, his voice no longer a raspy whisper, but a deep, commanding baritone that carried across the entire pavilion. He told her she was safe now. He told her she would never know hunger, pain, or humiliation ever again. He gently wiped the dirt from her forehead, thanking her for giving a dying man her last drop of water and for sacrificing her only coin when she had nothing left to give. Adeyemi slowly stood up. He turned his back to Amaka, positioning himself between her and the crowd like an impenetrable shield. The tenderness vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He locked his piercing eyes on Folake. The arrogant socialite physically recoiled. She trembled violently, her red silk dress shaking around her knees. Adeyemi's voice cut through the air like a sharpened blade. He stated that he had spent the last 6 months living in the gutters, disguising himself to find a single shred of genuine human decency in a city poisoned by greed. He pointed a dirt-stained finger directly at Folake's face. He told her she had poured wine on the only pure soul in the entire city. He declared that a woman who forces a pregnant mother to scrub her shoes was a disease, and he was the cure. Folake fell to her knees, openly weeping, begging for mercy. apologizing hysterically. But Adeyemi ignored her. He turned his devastating gaze to Obinna. Obinna looked like a man standing before an executioner. His expensive silk suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He opened his mouth to speak, to claim Amaka as his wife, to formulate a lie, but his voice failed him entirely. Adeyemi looked at him with absolute, unvarnished disgust. He told Obinna that he was the greatest fool on the continent. He had thrown away a diamond of immeasurable worth to chase after a piece of cheap, broken glass. Finally, Adeyemi looked at the mother-in-law. The older woman was hyperventilating, her gold jewelry clanking as she shook in terror. Before she could utter a single word of defense, Adeyemi raised his hand. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped forward from the shadows of the SUVs. He was Adeyemi's chief legal counsel. Adeyemi did not shout. He did not scream. He simply issued a series of commands that dismantled 3 lives in 10 seconds. He ordered his lawyer to instantly liquidate all holdings tied to Falake's family. He commanded the cancellation of every active contract, effectively plunging the arrogant real estate dynasty into immediate, inescapable bankruptcy. Falake's father collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands as his legacy evaporated into thin air. Then, Adeyemi gestured toward the estate gates. 2 heavy police vans, sirens wailing, rolled into the compound, followed by heavily armed officers. Adeyemi pointed directly at Obinna and his mother. He formally accused them of criminal assault, severe domestic abuse, and the attempted murder of an unborn child. He vowed to spend a fraction of his billions to ensure they faced the maximum penalty of the law, promising that the only luxury they would ever experience again was the cold concrete floor of a maximum security prison. The police officers moved in swiftly. The mother-in-law screamed, kicking and thrashing as cold steel handcuffs were locked forcefully around her wrists. She wailed, calling out to her son, but Obinna was already being dragged away. The man who had abandoned his pregnant wife in the rain was now weeping like a terrified child as the officers shoved him violently into the back of the dark police van. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The absolute, swift brutality of the karma was terrifying to witness. The judgment was complete. Adeyemi turned his attention back to the only person in the room who mattered. He signaled to his private medical team, who had arrived in one of the luxury SUVs. 2 paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher, lifting Amaka with the utmost care. Adeyemi walked beside her, holding her calloused, blistered hand in his own. He looked down at the exhausted, bewildered girl and made a vow in front of the entire terrified assembly. He told Amaka that she had shared her last coin with the blind beggar, and in return, he would share his entire empire with her. He promised that her unborn child would want for nothing, raised in palaces of marble and educated in the finest schools in the world. They carried her out of the pavilion, leaving the shattered, weeping villains behind in the ruins of their own arrogance. Less than an hour later, Amaka was no longer laying on the cold, wet carpet of a hostile estate. She was resting on a bed of pure white Egyptian cotton, flying thousands of feet above the African continent in Adeyemi's personal billion-dollar private jet. A team of world-class private doctors monitored her baby's heartbeat, assuring her that despite the trauma, the child was healthy and strong. Amaka looked out the window of the jet, watching the tiny, twinkling lights of the harsh city fade away into the darkness. She rested her hand on her swollen belly, a warm, overwhelming sense of peace finally washing over her weary soul. The long, agonizing storm had finally passed, and the morning sun was rising on a life of unimaginable joy. Obinna and his wicked mother would spend the rest of their miserable days locked in a humid, overcrowded prison cell, rotting in the poverty they had so deeply despised, while Amaka stepped into a destiny she had rightfully earned through the unbreakable purity of her spirit. This story teaches us that true kindness is never wasted. The universe has a way of rewarding those who give from the heart, even when they have nothing left to give. Success and wealth may reveal a person's true character, but it is the quiet, selfless sacrifices made in the darkest moments that truly define our destiny. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. Share it with your friends and family to spread the wisdom and lessons of traditional African storytelling.